There is a moment that almost everyone who has loved an emotionally distant person eventually experiences. It is the moment when you realize that no matter how sincere your words are, they seem to bounce off invisible walls. You try reassurance, you try appreciation, you try expressing how much you care, but instead of bringing you closer, something strange happens. The more heartfelt your words become, the more the other person seems to retreat into themselves. Their tone becomes calmer but colder. Their responses become shorter. And suddenly you are left wondering what you did wrong. What makes this confusing is that the person does not appear cruel or uncaring. In many cases, they are thoughtful, intelligent, and even quietly compassionate. They can listen deeply when conversations stay safe. They can be present in subtle ways that others miss. Yet when emotional closeness begins to deepen, something inside them seems to pull back, as if an internal alarm has gone off. Many people interpret this behavior as indifference. Others assume the person simply does not care enough. But the truth is far more complicated and far more human. For certain people, emotional distance is not a strategy to hurt others. It is a strategy their mind developed long ago to protect itself. Inside them, there is often a deeply ingrained instinct that equates closeness with risk. The closer someone gets, the more vulnerable they feel. And vulnerability can feel dangerous if, at some point in life, emotions were not met with safety or understanding. Because of this, they build psychological walls that are so subtle many people never even realize they exist. These walls are not loud, they are quiet boundaries inside the mind that control how much emotion can pass through at any given moment. And once those walls are built, breaking through them with normal emotional language becomes incredibly difficult. Ironically, the very words most people believe will create connection can have the opposite effect. Imagine telling someone, "You mean so much to me." For most people, this statement feels warm and affirming. But to someone who guards their emotional independence, those words can carry an invisible weight. Instead of hearing affection, part of their mind hears expectation. Expectation means responsibility. Responsibility means emotional pressure, and emotional pressure is exactly what their internal defenses are designed to avoid. So even when they appreciate the sentiment, something inside them begins to tighten, not because the words are wrong, but because the intensity feels overwhelming. This is why so many people who care deeply for someone emotionally distant eventually become confused. They keep trying harder. They offer bigger compliments, deeper confessions, stronger reassurance. But the harder they push emotionally, the stronger the walls become. And over time, a painful cycle begins to form. One person tries to create closeness through emotional expression. The other responds by protecting their independence through distance. Neither of them truly intends to hurt the other, but their instincts are moving in opposite directions. The first person believes connection grows through emotional intensity. The second person feels safe only when emotional intensity remains controlled. This silent misunderstanding can make relationships feel like a constant push and pull. And yet within this dynamic, there is one surprising truth that very few people realize. There is a specific kind of compliment that can pass through those invisible walls in a way most emotional language cannot. But before understanding why that compliment works, it is important to understand something about the walls themselves. Because those walls were not built randomly. They were built carefully, piece by piece, over years of experience. When someone learns early in life that emotional expression leads to discomfort, rejection, or misunderstanding, the mind adapts in remarkable ways. Instead of seeking emotional closeness openly, it begins to prioritize control and self-reliance. Feelings are not eliminated, they are simply managed internally rather than shared externally. Over time, this becomes second nature. From the outside, the person may appear calm, composed, even mysterious. They rarely overshare. They do not react dramatically to emotional situations. They often seem strong and independent in ways that others admire. But internally, something more complicated is happening. The emotional system is constantly monitoring the environment for signals of pressure. Anything that suggests someone is trying to pull them closer emotionally can trigger a subtle protective response. And compliments, surprisingly, can sometimes feel like exactly that. Most compliments focus on emotional closeness or admiration. They highlight how much someone means to us, how special they are, how deeply we care. But when someone hears those words through a lens of emotional self-protection, they can interpret them very differently. Instead of hearing appreciation, they may hear a growing expectation to reciprocate the same level of emotional openness. and that expectation can feel overwhelming. So they respond the only way their mind knows how. They create distance. This is why people who care about them often say the same thing again and again. I tried everything. They tried being more loving. They tried being more patient. They tried expressing appreciation in every way they could think of. And yet nothing seemed to reach the person behind the walls. But what most people do not realize is that the problem was never the sincerity of the words. The problem was the type of message those words carried. Because while many people crave emotional validation, individuals who guard their independence often crave something very different. They want to feel respected, not respected in a formal sense, but respected in the deepest psychological way possible. They want to know that the person in front of them is not trying to reshape them, control them, or slowly absorb their independence into the relationship. This fear of losing oneself is one of the most powerful forces behind emotional distance. Imagine constantly feeling like closeness might slowly erase the parts of you that make you feel safe and self-sufficient. Imagine worrying that if you open up too much, expectations will grow, demands will increase, and suddenly your independence will begin to shrink. For someone who has learned to rely heavily on themselves, that possibility feels terrifying. So their mind keeps the walls standing. But here is where something interesting happens. When a person finally hears a message that does not threaten their independence, their entire emotional system reacts differently. Instead of feeling pulled closer, they feel understood. Instead of sensing pressure, they feel space. And that feeling of space is something they rarely experience inside relationships. Most people, without realizing it, approach them with an underlying goal of emotional closeness. But when someone instead acknowledges their independence without trying to change it, something inside them softens. Because for the first time, the relationship does not feel like a quiet battle between closeness and freedom. It feels like acceptance. And acceptance is incredibly powerful. Think about how rarely people hear words that recognize who they truly are without trying to modify them. Many compliments carry an invisible message. You are wonderful because of how you make me feel. But the compliment that penetrates those emotional walls carries a very different message. It says, you are admirable, exactly as you are. When someone who protects their independence hears a compliment like that, it does something subtle but profound. It reassures the deepest fear inside them. The fear that closeness will eventually require them to become someone else. Instead, the message tells them the opposite. It tells them their independence is not a problem to be fixed. It is something that can be respected. And when that realization begins to settle in, something unexpected often happens. The walls do not collapse dramatically. They simply loosen. The distance becomes slightly smaller. Conversations become slightly longer. Eye contact lingers a little more than before. These changes are so subtle that many people miss them entirely, but they are the earliest signs that emotional safety is beginning to appear. And emotional safety is the one condition that slowly allows someone guarded to open up, not because they were forced to, not because they were persuaded, but because for the first time they feel like opening up will not cost them their sense of self. When someone realizes they can be close to another person without losing their autonomy, something inside them begins to shift. The mind no longer sees closeness as a threat. Instead, it begins to explore the possibility that connection and independence can exist at the same time. And that possibility is what makes a single compliment more powerful than endless emotional persuasion, because the right words do not push past the walls. They pass through the open door that respect quietly creates. And once that door opens even slightly, the dynamic between two people can begin to change in ways neither of them expected. The person who once seemed distant may start revealing small glimpses of thoughts they usually keep private. They may share something personal without being asked. They may linger in conversations that they once would have exited quickly. And these small moments often confuse people who have been trying for so long to reach them. But the reason for the shift is simple. The walls were never protecting them from connection itself. The walls were protecting them from the fear of losing control of who they are. When someone finally shows that they respect that identity, instead of trying to reshape it, those defenses no longer feel as necessary. And that is when the emotional distance that once seemed permanent begins to soften. Not through force, not through persuasion, but through a single message that quietly reassures the most guarded part of their mind. And this is where the most important moment in this entire dynamic begins to unfold. Because once you understand what those walls are protecting, you begin to realize that the words that reach someone guarded are not the ones that try to pull them closer. They are the ones that make closeness feel safe. And the surprising truth is that there is one specific type of compliment that accomplishes exactly that. The compliment that tends to pass through those emotional defenses sounds simple, almost understated. It is not dramatic. It does not overflow with emotion. In fact, that is precisely why it works. It is a sentence that quietly recognizes something they value deeply about themselves, something they have spent years protecting, something that many people misunderstand about them. The compliment sounds like this: "I really admire how you stay true to yourself." At first glance, these words may seem ordinary, but inside the mind of someone who guards their independence, they carry a very different meaning than most compliments. Most compliments focus on how someone makes us feel. They emphasize closeness, admiration, or emotional significance. But this statement does something entirely different. It recognizes the person's identity without trying to claim ownership of it. Instead of saying, "You mean so much to me," it says, "I see who you are." Instead of saying, "I need you," it says, "I respect you." That difference may seem small on the surface, but psychologically it changes everything. For someone who fears losing their independence inside relationships, hearing admiration for their authenticity feels incredibly disarming. It signals that the person speaking is not trying to reshape them into something more emotionally expressive or dependent. It signals acceptance, and acceptance is something many emotionally guarded people rarely experience. Throughout their lives, they often feel subtly misunderstood. People interpret their quietness as disinterest. Their independence is sometimes labeled as emotional distance. Their need for space is seen as avoidance. So they grow used to a certain pattern. Others try to pull them closer, and they instinctively move back to maintain balance. But when someone suddenly acknowledges the very trait they have been protecting all along, the emotional dynamic changes. Instead of feeling like they must defend their independence, they feel seen. And when a person finally feels seen rather than analyzed or corrected, their defenses soften. What makes this compliment even more powerful is that it does not contain any hidden demand. It does not imply that the person must now open up more. It does not suggest that their independence is merely a phase that should eventually disappear. It simply observes something genuine. And that observation creates emotional safety. Emotional safety is the single most important condition for someone guarded to slowly lower their defenses. Without it, every interaction feels like a subtle negotiation between closeness and self-protection. But when someone hears a compliment that respects their autonomy, something surprising happens internally. Instead of scanning for pressure, their mind experiences relief. Relief is a powerful emotional signal. It tells the nervous system that the environment is not threatening. It allows the body to relax. It allows the mind to become curious rather than defensive. And curiosity is the first step toward connection. When someone who usually keeps emotional distance suddenly feels safe enough to be curious about another person's intentions, their behavior begins to shift in subtle ways. They may ask more questions. They may listen more attentively. They may stay in conversations longer than they usually would. These moments often feel small and almost invisible, but they are incredibly meaningful. Because for someone who protects their emotional independence, connection does not grow through dramatic breakthroughs. It grows through quiet experiences of safety, repeated over time. Each moment that reinforces the idea that closeness does not equal control slowly reshapes the way they perceive relationships. And this is why the compliment works so effectively. It communicates respect instead of expectation. For someone who has spent years feeling like relationships might eventually demand more emotional exposure than they are comfortable with, hearing respect for their individuality feels profoundly reassuring. It tells them that they do not have to choose between connection and authenticity. They can have both. But there is another reason this compliment resonates so deeply. Many people who guard their emotional independence take quiet pride in the way they navigate the world. They value their ability to think independently, to stay grounded during emotional situations, and to maintain a sense of self, even when others around them are reacting intensely. These traits are often misunderstood by others, but they are deeply meaningful to the person themselves. So when someone acknowledges that strength instead of criticizing it, it touches something personal. It touches the part of them that rarely receives recognition. Think about how powerful it is when someone sees a quality in you that others have overlooked or misunderstood. That feeling can instantly create a sense of connection. For someone emotionally guarded, that recognition is especially impactful because it feels rare. Most people approach them with the unspoken goal of drawing them out emotionally. But when someone instead appreciates the calm, independent way they exist in the world, it disrupts the usual pattern. Instead of feeling like they are being gently pressured to change, they feel valued exactly as they are. And when a person feels valued without pressure, their internal defenses no longer need to stay as rigid. This is the moment when something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The walls that once felt necessary begin to loosen. Not because they were attacked, but because they are no longer needed in the same way. This shift does not happen instantly, and it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Instead, it shows up in small behavioral changes that are easy to miss if you are not paying attention. Someone who once kept conversations strictly practical may begin sharing small personal thoughts. Someone who usually maintains emotional distance may begin asking about your experiences or perspectives. These gestures are often quiet and understated, but they represent something important. They represent trust beginning to grow. Trust is not something that appears suddenly for someone who has spent years protecting their emotional boundaries. It develops gradually through repeated experiences of safety and respect. And each time someone hears a message that affirms their independence rather than threatening it, that trust deepens slightly. Over time, this can transform the emotional atmosphere between two people. The person who once seemed distant may start revealing more of their inner world. They may begin sharing opinions, memories, or reflections that they usually keep private. These moments often surprise the people around them, because the person who once seemed unreachable begins showing glimpses of depth that few others have seen. But what is really happening in these moments is not sudden emotional transformation. It is the gradual lowering of defenses that were built long ago. And those defenses lower not because someone forced them to open up, but because someone finally created an environment where openness feels safe. This is the quiet power of the right words. Not words that push past someone's boundaries, but words that make those boundaries feel respected. When a person senses that their identity is safe in the presence of someone else, the need for emotional walls begins to fade. And what replaces those walls is something much more meaningful. It is the possibility of connection without the fear of losing oneself. For someone who has spent years balancing independence with the quiet desire for understanding, that possibility feels incredibly powerful. It feels like discovering that closeness does not have to come at the cost of personal freedom. And once that realization begins to take root, something extraordinary can happen. The person who once seemed emotionally distant may begin moving closer on their own, not because they were persuaded, but because they finally feel safe enough to choose connection willingly. And when someone chooses closeness rather than being pushed toward it, the connection that forms is far more genuine. It is built on respect instead of pressure, understanding instead of expectation. And that is exactly why a single, carefully chosen compliment can sometimes reach places that years of emotional effort never could. And when this shift begins to happen, it rarely announces itself in obvious ways. There is no dramatic confession, no sudden emotional breakthrough. Instead, the change appears quietly, almost invisibly, in the small moments that most people would normally overlook. The person who once seemed guarded may suddenly hold eye contact a little longer during conversations. Their responses may become slightly more thoughtful instead of brief and distant. They may linger in discussions that previously would have ended quickly. Sometimes they begin asking questions they never asked before. These moments may feel subtle, but for someone who normally keeps their emotional world carefully protected, they are incredibly meaningful. Because what you are witnessing in those moments is the early stage of a wall beginning to lower. When a person who is used to protecting their independence hears a compliment that genuinely respects who they are, their mind starts reevaluating the situation. The relationship no longer feels like something that will eventually demand more emotional exposure than they are ready to give. Instead, it starts to feel balanced. Balanced relationships are something emotionally guarded people rarely experience. Many of their past interactions have followed the same pattern again and again. Someone becomes fascinated by their calm independence. The connection begins to grow. Then slowly, expectations start to increase. The other person wants more closeness, more emotional expression, more vulnerability. And at that moment, the alarm inside their mind begins to activate. They feel the pressure building, even if the other person does not realize it. That pressure makes them instinctively step back, creating distance before the relationship begins to feel overwhelming. But when someone expresses admiration for their authenticity, instead of pushing for deeper emotional intensity, the situation unfolds differently. There is no sudden expectation. There is no emotional demand hidden behind the compliment. There is only recognition. Recognition has a unique psychological effect. It tells someone that their identity is understood without being analyzed or corrected. And when someone who usually feels misunderstood finally experiences that kind of understanding, it creates something incredibly powerful: relief. Relief may not seem dramatic, but emotionally, it is one of the most transformative feelings a person can experience. Relief signals to the nervous system that the environment is safe. It tells the mind that it no longer needs to remain on guard. For someone who is used to protecting their emotional boundaries, that feeling of relief can be almost unfamiliar. Imagine living with the constant assumption that emotional closeness will eventually require you to change or sacrifice parts of yourself. Now imagine suddenly realizing that someone appreciates you precisely because you stay true to who you are. The tension inside you would begin to soften. You would start to relax in ways you may not even consciously notice. And that relaxation is exactly what allows connection to grow naturally. When a person feels safe enough to relax around someone, their curiosity begins to emerge. Curiosity is the opposite of emotional defense. Instead of scanning for potential pressure, the mind becomes interested in exploring the interaction. They begin paying closer attention to the person in front of them. They notice the tone of voice, the patience, the subtle signals that suggest this relationship may be different from others they have experienced before. This curiosity can slowly lead to something that once seemed impossible for them: emotional openness. Not the intense emotional sharing that many people expect, but small glimpses of their inner world. They might mention a thought they usually keep to themselves. They might express an opinion they normally avoid sharing. Sometimes they reveal small personal details about their past, their interests, or the way they see the world. These moments may seem ordinary on the surface, but for someone who has spent years guarding their emotional landscape, they are significant steps. Because every time they share something personal and the other person responds with calm understanding instead of pressure, their mind gathers new evidence. Evidence that closeness does not automatically lead to control. Evidence that someone can appreciate them without trying to reshape them. This is how trust slowly forms. Trust is not built through grand emotional gestures. It grows through consistent experiences that reinforce safety. And the compliment that respects their independence often becomes the first piece of that safety. It shows them that the person in front of them is not trying to break down their walls forcefully. Instead, that person is standing patiently outside those walls, acknowledging why they exist. That level of patience is rare. Most people become frustrated when they encounter emotional distance. They assume the other person simply does not care enough. They push harder, trying to extract deeper responses. But emotional pressure almost always strengthens the very defenses they are trying to overcome. The moment someone begins to feel pushed, their instinct to regain control activates immediately. Distance becomes their way of restoring balance. This is why understanding the difference between admiration and pressure is so important. Admiration says, "I appreciate who you are." Pressure says, "I need you to become more emotionally available for me." Even when those words are not spoken directly, emotionally guarded individuals are incredibly sensitive to the underlying message. They have spent years learning how to detect subtle emotional expectations in other people. Their instincts are highly tuned to anything that might threaten their independence. But admiration does not threaten them. In fact, admiration often strengthens their sense of identity. And when someone feels secure in their identity within a relationship, the fear of losing themselves begins to fade. This is when something remarkable begins to happen. Instead of constantly maintaining emotional distance, they start participating more actively in the connection. They might initiate conversations. They might share ideas or perspectives they would normally keep private. They may even express appreciation in their own understated way. These gestures may not look dramatic from the outside, but they represent something incredibly meaningful. They represent choice. When someone who usually protects their emotional independence begins choosing connection voluntarily, it means the relationship no longer feels threatening. It feels safe enough to explore. And exploration is how deeper emotional bonds begin to form. But there is another important reason this complement works so effectively. Many emotionally guarded people rarely hear recognition for the way they navigate the world. Their independence is often misunderstood as emotional detachment. Their calm demeanor can sometimes be mistaken for indifference. So they grow accustomed to being misinterpreted. People may admire their strength at first, but eventually they often hear subtle criticism suggesting they should be more expressive, more vulnerable, more emotionally available. Over time, these messages can make them feel like something about their natural personality is somehow wrong. But when someone instead acknowledges the strength it takes to remain authentic in a world full of emotional expectations, that recognition feels deeply validating. It tells them that their way of existing is not something that needs to be corrected. It is something that can be respected, and respect is one of the most powerful emotional bridges between two people. When respect becomes the foundation of a relationship, the need for defensive distance slowly fades. The walls that once felt necessary begin to feel less important, because the person inside those walls no longer feels like they are under emotional pressure. They feel understood. And when someone feels understood without being forced to reveal more than they are ready to share, they often begin opening up in ways that surprise even themselves. That is the quiet transformation that begins when the right words reach the right place inside someone's mind, not through intensity, not through persuasion, but through genuine recognition of who they truly are. And when someone begins to feel understood in that quiet way, something very subtle begins to shift inside them. It is not something they usually talk about, and often they may not even consciously recognize it themselves. But deep down, a certain tension that has existed for years slowly starts to loosen. For a long time, relationships may have felt like a balancing act to them. On one side, there was the natural human desire for connection. On the other side, there was the equally powerful need to protect their independence and emotional space. Most of the time, those two forces felt like they could not exist together, so they learned to lean toward independence. It felt safer that way. Safer to keep emotions contained, safer to stay slightly distant, safer to maintain control over how much of themselves they revealed to others. But when someone enters their life who quietly respects that independence instead of challenging it, the entire emotional equation begins to change. For the first time, closeness does not automatically feel like a threat. Instead, it begins to feel like a possibility. This is the moment where many emotionally guarded people start doing something they rarely do in relationships. They begin observing the other person more closely, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. They start noticing the way that person speaks to them, the patience in their tone, the absence of pressure, the way their individuality is acknowledged instead of questioned. These observations slowly build a new internal narrative. Maybe this relationship is different. Maybe closeness with this person will not require the same emotional sacrifices that previous connections seemed to demand. And once that possibility enters their mind, their behavior begins to shift in ways that often surprise both people involved. The person who once needed large amounts of space may start choosing to spend more time around you. The conversations that once stayed on safe, surface-level topics may gradually move into deeper territory. They may begin sharing thoughts about their past, small memories, personal opinions that reveal how they truly see the world. Each of these moments is incredibly significant, because for someone who has spent years protecting their inner world, sharing even small pieces of it requires trust. Trust is something they do not give quickly. But when it begins to grow, it often grows in a quiet, steady way that feels much more genuine than sudden emotional openness. This is why the complement that respects their authenticity has such a powerful long-term effect. It plants the first seed of emotional safety. And emotional safety is the one thing that can slowly transform distance into connection. But there is another truth that many people eventually discover when they experience this shift. Emotionally guarded individuals are often far deeper than they appear on the surface. Their quiet nature can make them seem mysterious or difficult to read, but internally they are constantly thinking, observing, and processing the world around them. They feel emotions just as strongly as anyone else. The difference is that they learned long ago to experience those emotions privately rather than expressing them openly. So when they finally encounter someone who respects their boundaries, instead of trying to force emotional exposure, they begin to feel something they may not have felt in a long time: relief mixed with gratitude. Gratitude for being accepted exactly as they are. That feeling can slowly awaken parts of them that have been dormant inside relationships. They may begin expressing appreciation in subtle ways, a thoughtful message, a quiet moment of honesty, a conversation that reveals something meaningful about how they see you. To someone unfamiliar with their emotional style, these gestures might seem small, but to someone who understands them, these gestures mean everything because they represent voluntary closeness. Not closeness that was demanded or negotiated, closeness that was chosen. And chosen connection is always stronger than forced connection. This is why patience and respect play such an important role in these dynamics. When someone feels that they have control over their emotional pace, they are far more willing to explore connection. But when they feel rushed or pressured, their instinct to withdraw quickly returns. That instinct is not about rejecting the other person. It is about protecting themselves. Once you understand this, the entire dynamic becomes easier to navigate. You begin to realize that emotional distance is often not a sign of indifference. It is a sign of caution. A cautious heart is not closed forever. It simply needs more time and more reassurance that opening up will not lead to losing itself. And the compliment that acknowledges their authenticity provides exactly that reassurance. It tells them that their individuality is not a problem that needs fixing. It is something worthy of admiration. When someone hears that message sincerely, it can change how they perceive the entire relationship. Instead of feeling like they must slowly transform into a more emotionally expressive version of themselves, they feel free to be who they already are. And ironically, that freedom is what often allows their deeper emotional side to appear naturally, because when people are no longer afraid of being pushed beyond their comfort zone, they become more willing to step forward on their own. This is why the walls around emotionally guarded individuals rarely fall dramatically. They soften. They lower gradually as trust grows. At first, there may only be small openings, a slightly longer conversation, a personal thought shared without hesitation, a moment of vulnerability that appears unexpectedly. But over time, those small openings begin to expand. The person who once seemed distant begins revealing more layers of themselves. You start seeing the quiet humor they rarely show others, the thoughtful way they analyze situations, the depth of emotion they usually keep hidden beneath calm composure. And when those layers finally begin to appear, many people realize something surprising. The person behind the walls was never cold. They were simply protecting a very sensitive inner world, a world that could only open in an environment where respect, patience, and understanding were present. This realization often changes the way people see emotionally guarded individuals forever, because it reveals something important. They were never avoiding connection. They were avoiding losing themselves inside it. And when someone finally shows them that connection does not require that sacrifice, the walls they built so carefully begin to lose their purpose. The distance fades, the conversations deepen, and what once felt like an impossible emotional barrier slowly becomes a bridge between two people who finally understand each other. All because of a simple message that carried more meaning than most people realize. A message that said, without pressure or expectation, I see who you are, and I respect it.